podcast is brought to you by Schema Business School.
Hello, welcome aboard. Welcome to the seminar on globalization. Coming next, we discuss globalization and two hot issues, cross-border strategy and offshoring. These are hot issues given their impact not only on economic growth and competitiveness, but also on employment. In most of the developed countries, this debate is at the heart of the relation between economic market forces and state intervention. It's not new, in fact. This debate started in the 1990s, but the global crisis that emerged in 2008 has made this issue central in most of Western Europe and in the US. And why? Because there is an increasing fragmentation at the company's value chain process. A growing fraction of the value of the company's domestic sales stem from foreign affiliates in foreign countries, including intermediate goods and services. Take, for example, the Apple's iPhone. It is produced within half a dozen countries, in companies in Germany, in South Korea, in the US, and in China. But in fact, Chinese workers simply put all the parts and components together. So this, in fact, will inflate the volume and value of Chinese exports, whereas, in fact, it stems from a global fragmentation of the value chain process. Now, globalization is not guilty of offshoring when companies in the West, in the EU, in the US, in fact, confront negative evolution in business conditions coming from higher labor costs, higher taxes, or country risk volatility. A number of companies, if we look at France, decided to cross the borders, and invest and produce in Central Europe, but also in Latin America and in Asia, in the Maghreb also. Examples such as Amora, Decathlon, Karcher, Salomon, Look and Petit Bateau in Tunisia, maybe not for long, Michelin in the US, Capgemini, and in the car industry, Renault and also Peugeot. There are in fact twofold strategies. On the one side, there is horizontal foreign direct investment, and the game plan is to go offshore to produce, to get closer to large market of consumers in fact, fast-growing countries, including the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, but also the US. That's the case of Michelin, PSA, Peugeot, and Renault. Another strategy consists of so-called vertical foreign direct investment. There's an offshore strategy to benefit from better business conditions outside the home country. Lower taxes, better inputs of labor, cheaper labor also. And then the products, the outputs, get back to the home country. That's the case of Decathlon or Look, for example. But Look is still working both in Nevers and in Tunisia, but a good deal of the production is now outsourced into cheaper producing countries. This global outsourcing of comparative advantage is not only coming from developed countries, the triad, Japan, US, and Europe, but also developing countries, fast-growing, dynamic, competitive, such as Brazil, Russia, India, and China, also embark on outsourcing strategies. As we shall see, global outsourcing creates jobs in foreign countries, contributing to higher purchasing power, but they also transfer technologies from more advanced to developing countries. However, outsourcing and FDI also impact negatively on the job market within the home country. So what we have to do today, in fact, is a net impact of job lost in the home country and jobs created due to larger demand in foreign countries. If we look, for example, at the EU, at the Eurozone, the 17 countries get large amounts of FDI inflows. And why? Because MNCs from all over the world target a mass consumer market of close to 330 million consumers. But in the meantime, European MNCs export twice as much capital investment outside to benefit from better business conditions outside Western Europe. There has been a high volatility in these FDI flows in and out Europe, with sharp cuts starting at the time of the global crisis in 2008. There are signs of growing outflows and inflows to get back to around $500, $600 billion. It is not only the EU, China also, got larger and larger amounts of foreign direct investment, up to around $100 billion in 2008, 2010. That's around 4% of China's GDP. But in the meantime, Chinese MNCs are more and more competitive, and they export capital in cheaper labor countries, including neighbor countries, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Bangladesh, to benefit from cheap labor cost and also growing domestic markets. Let us not forget that the bulk of FDI remains within the 34 developed countries of the OECD, around half of total FDI. And regarding trade, let us not forget that a good deal of the trade in Europe, for example, is within the EU. In France, 60% of overall trade takes place within the EU countries. In fact, it goes up to 80% for the Netherlands, for example. This has led a few scholars, including Rogman, to conclude that globalization is almost a myth. And why? Because the majority of trade and investment remains within regions. In fact, MNCs, according to Rogman, are regionally based and locally operated. And probably it's true. Again, the three largest regions in the world, the EU, the US, and Japan, account for the bulk of trade and investment transactions. MNCs are not only crossing borders to produce offshore, but in fact they also use a global fragmentation of the value chain process to benefit from specific values and comparative advantage in countries. For example, if we look at Google, its Google Finance concept was conceived by the Google team in India, and then Google engineers around the world got involved in this process, adding value, making in fact this Google Finance network a truly global integrated process. Now, why companies decide to embark on outsourcing strategy? Well, there are probably a number of initiatives. The first one is to benefit from dynamic market outside, more consumers, fast-growing population, and fast-growing GDP. The second is to benefit from a better cost, lower cost outside, not only exchange rates, but also labor cost and taxes. You have also countries which offer comparative advantage. Manpower is better trained, more qualified, more competitive. Natural resources are made available at better cost. And the geographic proximity of a large market like Mexico and the US. There's also technical progress and productivity increases in a number of emerging market countries. And last but not least, country risk is the name of the game. MNCs, in fact, will decide to move into lower volatility countries which have a stable economic, social, and political framework. So the first source of offshoring strategy is definitely getting close to a dynamic market demand. Getting close, in fact, to consumers. Where are they? Well, where the population is growing. Not in the West. If we look at the total population of the West as a share of the global population, it is shrinking. Since the 1950s, it was 20% in 1950. It's up to around 10-11% as of 2013. It will decrease probably to lower than 10% in 2050. Definitely, democratic growth is not taking place in the West, EU, US, and Japan. In fact, the growth is about to take place in a number of developing countries, including Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, but also India and Turkey. Where will population growth shrink? Well, in developed countries such as Spain, Germany, Italy, but also two BRICS, i.e. China and Russia. And this, in fact, will trigger deeply-rooted structural challenges for the next 50 years. MNCs get close to developing country markets due to higher growth rates. Indeed, the global increase in GDP is around 3% today. But it's much higher. It's 5-6% in developing countries and only 2% in developed countries. Emerging market countries grow faster, twice as fast as the developed countries of the OECD. But growing faster doesn't help much to catch up if you start the race well behind your competitors. So definitely the growth rates of GDP are much higher. But again, the economic catching up will take time and probably not before the 2030. If we look at the long haul, 1950-2050, 1 century of GDP evolution, in fact, the curves might cross probably in the next 10 years, around 2030, 2035. And definitely in 2050, the largest GDPs in the world will be located in Asia, China, India, but also Brazil and Russia. So major shifts are taking place, not only in the production, but also in consumption markets, with growing shares coming from developing countries, fast-growing emerging markets. Markets are shifting east, outside the OECD. Not only population increases, but GDP increases. The fastest growing countries clearly are the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. South Africa also. The second reason for this outsourcing strategy comes from cheaper inputs outside the home country. And this is a base for a higher competitive edge. The first source of motivation for MNCs to export outside the home country is either a declining working population in the home country or larger working population outside the home country, in foreign countries. Looking at the chart on the screen, we see that a good number of developed countries, in fact, face today declining working population. The age pyramid, in fact, is shifting. It is very clear in the case of Europe. In the 1990s until 2000, there was a sort of demographic balance in Europe, with the bulk of the population belonging to the working age between, let's say, 25 and 55. Well, in fact, the active population now is shrinking. And in 2050, a major productivity challenge will stem from a growing share of the population outside the working age, or about to leave the working age, around 50. And that will basically create a challenge not only of productivity, but of course also of pension retirements. This issue of market consumption and working population touches both France and Germany. In 2000, the working age population share was around 55% in Germany and France. If we look at the medium term, that is 2030, in both countries we have a sharp drop in this share of working age population below 50%. Another source of competitive advantage in developing countries stems from lower labor cost. If we look, for example, at Peru or Tunisia, a worker, an unskilled worker, gets paid around 200 euros per month. An engineer, around 1,000. Little bit higher in Mexico. Probably an unskilled worker gets paid 300 euros. Does that make Mexico less competitive? Well, no. And why? Because in fact, a multinational corporation will look at two variables in the equation to move offshore. Number one, the labor cost, cheaper, but number two, the productivity. In the case of Mexico, the labor cost compared to China is higher today in Mexico, but productivity is much larger than China, hence the competitive advantage of Mexico gets larger than China. And things, in fact, might move in the wrong direction in China as the labor cost is increasing by roughly 15-20% per year, making Mexico more and more competitive vis-à-vis China. Plus, Mexico benefits from the geographic proximity of the US market, which is not the case of China, that in fact has to meet large transportation costs. The competitive challenge that China faces regarding its market cost of production, its higher labor cost, has led a number of MNCs from China to embark into FDI toward Southeast Asia, Laos, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, to benefit from lower labor costs and cheaper natural resources. Not only, in fact, in Asia, but also in Africa. Chinese companies are investing massively in countries which benefit from raw materials and oil production. Chinese multinationals have embarked in global shopping recently. In the summer of 2012, the leading Chinese manufacturer of construction machinery, namely Sany, bought Puzzmeister in the high-tech region of Bad Württemberg. And a few weeks after, Puzzmeister, now controlled by China, bought Intermix, in fact increasing the investment industrial presence of China in Germany and in the West. The next parameter for an offshoring strategy is access to large market of consumers and also stable, less volatile country risk. But how to assess the consumption market potential? Well, MNCs, in fact, will look at two parameters. Number one, the market increase, which can be assessed by looking at GDP per capita, for example. And number two, the risk, of course. Ideally, MNCs should invest in high market potential and low risk, which is not known in any country in the world. Even in developed countries, there's always a combination of risk and opportunities, as we shall discuss in the country risk session. So these markets, which are considered with a large potential and acceptable quote-unquote country risk, today are China, India, Mexico, South Korea, and also Turkey. These countries, in fact, have the largest potential for growing middle class, that is, higher consumer market. In 2050, the vast majority of middle class consumers will be located into a few countries in Asia, including, of course, China, India, and Vietnam. But how to target the evolution in the middle class consumption market? Well, the target, in fact, is a GDP per capita between $4,000 and $17,000. Today, around 500 million of these consumers live in emerging markets, in developing countries. But in 2050, not 500, but 4 times as much, 2 billion consumers, in fact, in this middle class section will be located into developing countries. The vast majority, in fact, of middle class consumers will no longer live in developed, but in developing countries. Another definition to target middle class consumers can also use the car market. After all, cars are driven by middle-class consumers. And if we look at the projections in the car consumer market, we have almost the same picture, i.e. the vast majority of car producers and consumers will be located into developing countries, first of all in China, then Brazil and India. Last but not least, country risk is a major parameter for offshoring and outsourcing strategy. There are signs in many countries of a shift back to the home country. In the Maghreb, for example, in Egypt, in Tunisia, companies might meet problems of higher labor costs, of higher taxes, of FDI obstacles, of bureaucracy, of corruption. And this, in fact, will lead these countries to move from outsourcing to resourcing. Many Japanese companies, in fact, have resourced their activities from China back to Japan. The last point we need to discuss is the impact of outsourcing on domestic job losses in the home markets, namely in the developed countries. How much job losses stem from outsourcing and FDI? As we remember, in September 1999, Michelin announced in the same day rising profits and 7,500 layoffs over 3 years. A few days after, the French Parliament voted the so-called Michelin Amendment. Before any restructuring, companies must open working hours negotiations. In fact, the amendment was cancelled in 2004. More recently, in July 2012, Peugeot PSA stock market price rose when it announced a refocus production strategy outside France in fast-growing markets such as Russia, Slovakia, India, Brazil, and Argentina. And this has led to not only policy but also political debates, not only in France, not only in Europe, but also in the US. How many jobs get lost due to offshoring from the home countries to emerging market countries? In fact, we have to look at the interplay between jobs lost due to outsourcing on the one side and jobs created by MNCs in their home country thanks to growing markets outside and also larger exports from the home country to developing countries. The problem is that these jobs are not lost and created in the same sector, in the same region. Hence, a challenge of training, relocating, and flexibility in the job market. Let's think of Lorraine, for example, the industrial region, which has lost thousands of jobs, maybe recreated in other regions, but a major regional and sectoral impact. If we look, for example, at one single year, we have in France 45,000 jobs lost, of which only 2,000 were lost due to offshoring, a ratio of around 4%, which is in fact as good as the UK or Sweden. So if we look at one specific year, but in fact the same trend can be observed since the 1990s, the share of jobs lost due to outsourcing and offshoring strategy is not that high. It's around 5%. And this, in fact, this number, relatively modest, is similar in most of the developed countries in the OECD. Let us not forget that if a number of jobs are lost due to outsourcing, a large number of jobs are created due to or thanks to FDI in developed countries, such as France. In France, for example, there are around 2.5 million jobs coming from MNCs. And these foreign companies are also the source of 20% of R&D and of 1/3 of French exports. This, in fact, has to do with the country's attractiveness. And developing countries compete to attract foreign direct investment. And France, in fact, is losing its competitive edge as the UK or Germany, in fact, maybe Spain, are getting larger and larger FDI projects in their countries. The point is that the jobs created and lost do not take place in the same sector and the same region of a country's economy. If we look at the EU as a whole, for example, there is a much larger number of jobs created in services than jobs lost in manufacture or agriculture sector. And these jobs created in the services sector, fast growing, are high-skilled jobs, whereas the jobs lost in agriculture or industrial sector are low-skilled or medium-skilled jobs. Same story in the US. Debate is raging in policy and political circles to know how much jobs have been lost in the US due to offshoring and outsourcing. And these numbers, in fact, stay modest. The interplay between offshoring and trade explains only 20% of job lost in the US. In the meantime, the interplay between productivity and demand changes explain the bulk, 80% of job lost. Productivity, in fact, boosts the production, but in the meantime, it shrinks the demand for jobs. The key forces at play are technological changes, investment overhang in the US, and changing consumption behavior, and all this has large impact on job losses. Not only outsourcing should not be blamed, but trade neither. If we look, for example, at the combination of these two curves, imports and unemployment, we see a large increase in the 1990s in imports, whereas unemployment is shrinking. And since the 2008 crisis, unemployment increases, whereas imports decrease. So trade should not be blamed. In particular, trade with China is not to be blamed. The US trade deficit, in fact, got larger and larger since the 1990s, and much larger than the share of the deficit coming from China. So how much job losses stem from outsources? Well, a number close to 2%, between 1.5 and 2%, seems acceptable. 2% of private employment, is lost due to outsourcing and offshoring. In the meantime, any dollar invested outside the US by MNCs is producing a larger amount of dollars, in fact 1.13, in new wealth for America's economy, coming from larger exports and in developing countries, and also new jobs created in services in the high-skilled sector. The New York Fed has also looked at the impact of trade on unemployment in the US, and its research concludes that around 2.4% of total US employment has been lost due to trade outside the American economy. The LSE has also looked at the issue, and it shows that offshoring, in fact, tends to push US workers toward more complex, high-skilled jobs, and in the meantime, offshore workers in developing countries specialized is less skilled employment. So all in all, globalization is not guilty for this shift into employment between developing and developed countries. A good deal of the explanation stems from the long-term structural changes in the global economy. There's a long-term trend decline in the share of industry to GDP and of industrial employment due to service externalization. If we look at industry per se, it's probably around 15% of the total GDP of developed countries. However, if we add services which have been externalized, the share of industrial output probably rise up to 30%. In most developed countries, the share of manufactured goods demand in GDP tends to decrease as income increases, including through prices decreases. And manufacturing competitiveness is based on productivity increases, and productivity increases tends to have a negative impact on unemployment. productivity increases explain close to 30% of job lost, and foreign competition around 35%. The share of industrial jobs has been dropping in each and every of the developed countries in the OECD. That share was around 25% in the 1980s. It's only, in fact, 10% today. And the main source of this drop in industrial jobs stem from IT, higher technology, which leads to higher productivity. And this is at the heart of economic development and modernization. So, all in all, emerging market countries are not to be blamed for the structural shifts of economic development. Basically, there are two key issues: higher technologies and higher productivity. The key challenge for developed countries, as for developing countries, is R&D. There is a race for boosting R&D investment efforts, for also innovation, for education, and for training. And this, in fact, will help countries to meet the challenges of structural changes in the globalization. Thank you.